The letter arrived unexpectedly, tucked under my door like it had been waiting for me. The moment I saw it, I felt something unnatural. The paper was ancient, crinkled, with no sign of a return address or a sender's name. I hesitated before opening it, feeling the weight of it press down on my chest. Inside, the message was simple, cold, and chilling. Your presence is required. We need you at the Great Pyramid of Giza. A lighthouse keeper is needed. The rules must be obeyed. No further explanation, no details, just an ominous command. I could have thrown it away, walked away, pretended I never saw it. But the words haunted me in a way I couldn't shake. The rules must be obeyed. For reasons I still can't fully understand, I packed my things, booked a flight, and boarded the first plane to Egypt. I had no idea what I was walking into, but one thing was certain: I would never be the same again. The journey was long, and the further I traveled, the more I felt a strange weight in the air. The thick desert heat seemed to swallow everything, and the landscape around me blurred into an endless stretch of sand. It was as though the world outside had vanished, leaving only the overwhelming presence of the pyramid in the distance. The closer I got, the more I felt it, an eerie pull, like something was calling me, drawing me closer. My heart raced as I drove toward the pyramid, the towering structure looming in front of me, far more imposing than I had ever imagined. Its ancient stones seemed to pulse with a dark energy, casting long, menacing shadows on the ground. The weight of history, of something far older and darker than I could comprehend, pressed against me. I finally arrived, the pyramid's shadow swallowing my car whole. The massive stone structure felt alive, shifting, breathing. As I stepped out of the car, I couldn't help but notice the silence, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the world itself had held its breath. I was standing at the entrance of the Great Pyramid of Giza, but it didn't feel like history. It didn't feel like the ancient wonder I'd studied in school. It felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but something about this place was off, as though I had stepped into a realm where time and space didn't behave the way they were supposed to. Inside, the air was colder than I expected. It was more than just temperature. There was something in the air, something dense, thick, like the atmosphere was pressing down on me. The walls of the pyramid were covered in carvings, some faded with age, others sharp and fresh, as though they were warning me. I couldn't read them, but the sensation of being watched made it impossible to ignore them. Every step I took felt heavier, as if I were sinking into the stone itself. Then I saw it. At the heart of the pyramid stood a lighthouse. It shouldn't have been there. A modern lighthouse, gleaming and alive amidst the ancient stone of the pyramid. The contrast was jarring, but worse than its modernity was the glow. The light, the beacon, wasn't just light. It wasn't just an object meant to guide ships or travelers. It pulsed. It was like it was breathing, alive, watching me, and the moment my eyes locked onto it, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The light wasn't just shining, it was alive, and it was reaching out, calling me. Before I could react, a figure stepped from the shadows. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, his body thin and frail. He moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, as if each step required more effort than the last. This was Zivian Krith, the previous keeper of the lighthouse. I could see it in his eyes, the exhaustion, the fear, the hopelessness. He wasn't just a man, he was a ghost, a remnant of someone who had been here far too long. "You're here," he said, his voice crackling like dry leaves. "The light. You must keep it on. It's the only thing keeping the world from unraveling." He looked over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously to the beacon. "You have to obey the rules. The rules are everything." I could feel the air grow colder as his words sank in. I didn't understand. What was this? What was happening here? "The light," Zivian whispered again, his hands shaking. "Never turn it off." His eyes flickered, as if something were moving behind him, something I couldn't see. His face twisted in terror. "And you must never leave after nightfall. Never!" Before I could respond, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone in the heart of the pyramid with a pulsing light. The silence felt suffocating, but Zivian's words echoed in my mind. each one like a weight pressing on my chest. The rules. The rules must be obeyed. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the lighthouse and wondering if I was losing my mind. The place was wrong. Everything was wrong. The stone walls, the light, the air. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the rules. The first rule: never turn off the light. But why? What would happen if I broke the rule? My heart pounded, my thoughts racing as I tried to make sense of it all. The pyramid was ancient, full of secrets, but there was something else here. Something darker, something I couldn't yet understand. As I turned away from the lighthouse to explore further, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was subtle at first, just a faint, nagging sensation, but the longer I stayed, the more it grew, until I could feel it pressing against me, suffocating me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I didn't know what kind of place I had walked into, but the fear had already taken root. And as the night drew closer, I knew that I would have to decide: could I follow the rules, or would I risk everything to break free? The nights were the hardest. I had thought that the strangest part of my job would be the isolation, but it was the atmosphere, the feeling that something was always watching me, that gripped me with an unshakable sense of dread. At first, I tried to dismiss the unease as nervousness. After all, who wouldn't feel a little off in a place like this, surrounded by ancient walls that held secrets no one had spoken of for centuries? But over the course of the first few nights, things started to happen. Small things, little disturbances that at first seemed like tricks of the mind. Shadows moving when they shouldn't, the kind of thing you catch out of the corner of your eye and write off as fatigue. But then it started happening more frequently, the movements becoming deliberate, almost mocking. I'd turn a corner, and for a split second, I'd catch a dark shape darting behind me, only for it to vanish when I looked again. The light, the lighthouse beacon, was another strange thing. It flickered, sometimes like it was struggling to stay alive. At times it would burn bright, almost blindingly so, and then it would dim, as if something was pulling at it. I had checked the controls several times, convinced it was some mechanical malfunction, but everything was in perfect working order. Still, the erratic behavior of the light made the hairs on my neck stand on end, a chill creeping up my spine each time it sputtered, as if I was being watched by something far older than the pyramid itself. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse wasn't just a beacon. It was something more, something powerful, and it didn't want me there. One evening, after I had spent hours inspecting the lighthouse's strange pulsing light, I found something odd. Tucked behind the control panel was a crumpled piece of paper, hidden from view. It had been deliberately shoved out of sight, as though someone didn't want me to find it. My fingers shook as I unfolded it, a strange sense of dread washing over me as I read the note in Zivian's messy handwriting. "Never leave the lighthouse at night," it said. I laughed it off at first. It sounded ridiculous, like some kind of superstition or irrational warning from a man who had been here too long. After all, what could possibly happen if I left? I needed fresh air. I needed to stretch my legs. The thought of staying in that small, oppressive space all night, with nothing but the flickering light and the endless whispers of shadows, made me uneasy. But still, there was something about the note, something in the way it was written, in the urgency behind it, that made me pause. The next evening, I decided to ignore Zivian's warning. I was tired of the confined space. I had to leave, even if just for a short time. I locked the lighthouse behind me, letting the silence of the pyramid envelop me as I stepped out into the night air. The stars above were distant, cold and unblinking, and the air was thick with the scent of dust and stone. That's when I saw her, a shadow standing at the edge of the pyramid. I hadn't noticed her at first, and then, like a flicker of light, she was just there. Her form was blurred, as if she wasn't fully there at all. Her outline shifted and wavered like a mirage. I froze. The woman, if it was even a woman, was tall, slender, with dark flowing hair that cascaded down her back. Her face was pale, almost translucent, but her eyes were dark, unblinking, as if she had been waiting for me. "I wouldn't do that," she said, her voice a soft whisper that felt like it came from all directions at once. "Not if you want to stay alive." I took a step back, unsure whether I was dreaming or losing my mind. "Who are you?" My voice cracked as I spoke. "What do you want?" "I was once like you," she said, her voice growing colder. "I worked here, at the lighthouse, but I broke the rules. I left. I thought I could escape. I thought I could leave it all behind, but that was the mistake. I'm not really here anymore, but I'm still bound to this place." Her words sank deep into me, like icy fingers curling around my heart. Something about her, something in the way she spoke, sent a wave of terror washing over me. I tried to turn away, to run back to the safety of the lighthouse, but her presence held me there, like a force I couldn't resist. "You're not as free as you think," she continued. "The pyramid is not what it seems, and neither are you once you break the rules." The words echoed in my mind as I stumbled back into the lighthouse, my heart pounding in my chest. I could still feel her gaze on me, even after I'd slammed the door shut behind me. The wind outside picked up, howling like a beast, and the air in the lighthouse seemed to grow even heavier, suffocating. I could hear it, faintly at first, the whispering voices from the walls. At first I thought I was imagining it, the stress of my mind playing tricks on me. But then it grew louder, and I realized the truth. There were voices, soft, murmuring voices, coming from deep within the stone. They were speaking in a language I couldn't understand, and they were getting closer, drawing nearer. I didn't know what to make of it. The warning from Zivian, the cryptic message from Ilara, the shadows that moved when they shouldn't, the light that flickered and pulsed, like it was alive. Nothing made sense, and yet everything felt wrong. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with thoughts of the pyramid's secrets, of the rules that seemed to govern everything here. The second rule, the one Zivian had written about, never leave the lighthouse at night, had to be more than just a precaution. It wasn't about safety. It was about something far darker, something I couldn't even begin to understand. The walls were closing in on me. I could feel the weight of the pyramid pressing down on me, like the stones themselves were alive, watching, waiting. I had to find out the truth. But the more I tried to resist, the more the pyramid fought back, pulling me closer to the light, to the rules that held me captive. What would happen if I left again? What would happen if I broke them? As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, not by anything I could see, but by something I could feel. And the worst part? I had no idea how to escape. The pyramid had a hold on me, and I was afraid that, just like Ilara, I was already too far gone to break free. The rules were all that kept me alive, but what if breaking them was the only way to learn the truth? The wind howled through the cracks in the pyramid's ancient walls, sending a shiver down my spine as I stood in the lighthouse, staring out at the violent storm raging outside. I had never seen weather like this before, unnaturally wild and intense. The sky was an angry shade of red, swirling with dark, churning clouds that seemed to pulse with energy. The air felt charged, as though the storm itself was alive, and the thunder rumbled like some great beast waking from its slumber. My heart thudded in my chest as I stood frozen in place. I had to get out of there. I needed fresh air. I needed to think clearly. But something about the storm kept me rooted in the lighthouse, my eyes glued to the swirling chaos outside. It wasn't just the storm itself. It was the feeling that it was waiting for something. The wind pressed against the walls, groaning as though the pyramid itself was struggling against the tempest. And then there was the light. The beacon. It flickered, erratic and unstable, as though it too was being swept up in the storm. I could hear the light, almost like it was breathing, shuddering with each gust of wind. It was as though something deep within the pyramid was stirring, waking up to the storm's presence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt an overwhelming sense of foreboding. I stepped away from the window, but before I could gather my thoughts, something caught my eye. A piece of paper, tucked under the control panel. My pulse quickened as I picked it up, the handwriting different from Zivian's, older, more ancient. The note was brief, but its words struck me with an icy grip. Never approach the light during a storm, the third rule. I stared at the paper, my mind racing. Why would a storm affect the light so strongly? What was so dangerous about the light during a storm? The more I thought about it, the more questions swirled in my mind. The first rule had been about keeping the light on, and the second about staying in the lighthouse at night. But this was different. A storm was beyond my control. Could it really be dangerous to get near the light during something like this? The thought seemed absurd. But then again, so did everything else about this place. As if on cue, the voice from the light began again, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. It was faint, carried on the wind, but I could hear it clearly now. "Help me," it whispered. The sound seemed to come from the very core of the lighthouse, as though the beacon itself was speaking. My breath caught in my throat. The voice was chilling, desperate. It felt like it was calling to me, pulling me toward it, but something was wrong. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. The voice was too pleading. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a lure, a trap. My legs felt like they were moving on their own. I tried to fight it, tried to turn away, but the pull was irresistible. I felt like I was being dragged toward the light, the storm outside intensifying as I walked closer to the control panel. The air around me seemed to grow colder, thicker, as if the pyramid itself was tightening around me. I couldn't escape it. I had to know what was happening, what this place wanted from me. The storm outside howled with greater force, rattling the walls of the pyramid. It was as if the storm was alive, enraged, and my mind raced. Was this a warning, or was it something else? Was the storm an omen that something was about to happen? My thoughts spiraled, but I couldn't stop moving. I had to get closer. I reached for the light. The moment my fingers brushed the cold surface of the lighthouse beacon, I felt a shock run through me. The world seemed to blur around the edges, my vision flickering in and out of focus. The walls of the pyramid seemed to shift, and in an instant, I was no longer standing in the lighthouse. I was somewhere else. Somewhen else. I saw it then, the full, terrifying truth. The visions hit me in a wave, and my breath caught in my throat as they unfolded before me. The pyramid's creators, their faces twisted in desperation, carving symbols into the stone. Jorvik Malnoth. The ancient figure, his hands moving over the rock, etching out the secret of the lighthouse. The symbols were clear now, the meaning slowly seeping into my mind like poison. The lighthouse wasn't just a structure. It wasn't just some relic. It was a prison. The light was not a beacon, it was a barrier, holding something back, something ancient and powerful, something that the storm had awakened. The storm wasn't just a weather event. It was a signal, a sign that the entity trapped in the pyramid was growing restless, that the time had come for it to break free. I stumbled back from the light, gasping for air, my heart racing. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in on me, and I could hear the whispers again. Voices that weren't human, that weren't even alive, but still spoke, still called to me. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind battering the pyramid as if it was trying to tear it apart. But the worst part was that I had felt it. The pull of the light, the tug of the entity growing stronger, more desperate. The storm had been just the beginning. The rules, Zivian's warnings, had been there to keep me in check, to keep me from breaking the barrier. But now I had no idea what would happen next. I was trapped, and I knew deep down that I was running out of time. The third rule wasn't just a precaution, it was a warning. If I didn't stay away from the light, if I didn't obey the rules, whatever was coming from that storm, from the depths of the pyramid, would claim me. The silence in the lighthouse felt heavier now, oppressive, as though the air itself was thick with something unnatural. Every night the whispers had grown louder, more frantic. I could hear them coming from the light. No, not just from the light, but from within it. There was something in there, something waiting. The storm hadn't been a random event, it had been a warning. And now, I was certain I was running out of time. I spent days scouring every corner of the lighthouse, piecing together whatever I could find. It felt like I was being guided, as though some unseen force was pushing me to uncover the truth. The carvings, the symbols. Yorick Malnuth's work had been a message, a warning to anyone who might come after him. The more I looked at them, the more they seemed to burn themselves into my mind. Every stroke of the chisel now imprinted in my thoughts. It wasn't until I found the hidden chamber, a small, forgotten room beneath the lighthouse, that I understood the true horror of my situation. The room was filled with dust and cobwebs, the air stale and old, as though it hadn't been touched in centuries. But there, on the wall, were more carvings. This time, not from Jorvik, but from someone else. Someone far older. Talis Verondar. I stared at the symbols, my blood running cold. They were different, darker, the lines twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. Talis had been one of the original creators of the lighthouse, part of the ancient order that had built it to contain something far worse than any of us could understand. This wasn't just a lighthouse, it was a prison. The truth came crashing into me piece by piece. The lighthouse had been constructed not to signal ships or protect the coast, but to contain a malevolent entity, something dark and ancient, something that fed on the souls of those who tended to it. Each keeper had been bound to the lighthouse, their lives slowly drained away by the light, their souls consumed, becoming part of the pyramid itself. I stared at the wall in horror as I understood the fate of the men who had come before me. Zivian Krith, he hadn't left voluntarily. He had been consumed, his soul twisted and merged with the very stone and light of the pyramid. I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, like a living thing, waiting for me to make a mistake. The rules weren't just precautions, they were chains, shackles that kept the entity contained, kept it from breaking free. They had to be obeyed, not for our safety, but for the safety of the world. If I broke them, if I turned off the light, if I left the lighthouse during the storm, it wouldn't just be my soul lost, it would be everyone's. The entity would escape, and the world would fall into darkness. But as the days passed, the temptation to break the rules became unbearable. The light's pull on me grew stronger. At first, it had been subtle, a strange compulsion, like an itch at the back of my mind. But now, it was like a physical presence, a weight on my chest, pushing me toward the beacon. The whispers never stopped. Every time I tried to focus, to think clearly, they were there, growing louder. "Help me," he called. The voice from the light, but now it was different. It wasn't just a plea, it was a demand. It was angry, and worse, it was beginning to feel familiar. I felt myself slipping. I knew what would happen if I broke the rules. I had read the stories, seen the carvings, understood the fate of those who had come before me. But every time I turned my back on the light, every time I tried to stay away, the temptation grew stronger. I could hear it in my mind now. The voice was calling me, pulling me toward it. I knew I had to stay away, but the more I resisted, the more I felt my will slipping away. The worst part, I wasn't sure I wanted to resist anymore. I stumbled back into the lighthouse control room, my thoughts clouded. The air around me felt heavier, thicker, as though the pyramid itself was pressing in on me. The light flickered, dimming and brightening in strange intervals, as though it too was struggling to stay alive. But there was something else there now, something I hadn't noticed before. A presence, watching me, waiting for me to make a choice. My fingers brushed the control panel, and I felt a shock run through me. But it wasn't pain, it was connection. The light, the pyramid, the entity. It was all part of me now, part of this place. I understood then. The rules weren't just about keeping the light on or staying inside at night. The rules were a bargain. The pyramid demanded a soul, a life. Zivian's soul, Talis's soul, and now mine. Every keeper who had worked here had made that sacrifice, willingly or not, and I would be next. I could feel it now, deep in my bones. The light was not just a beacon. It was a curse, and I was its next victim. The rules had been put in place to keep the curse contained, but they were slowly breaking, and I was being pulled toward the inevitable. The entity wanted me, wanted my soul, and I had no choice but to give it. I was trapped, and the worst part was that I wasn't sure I wanted to escape anymore. The light had claimed me, just as it had claimed Zivian, just as it had claimed Talus, and now there was no turning back. The entity was waking, and it was hungry. It was only a matter of time before it was free, and when it was, I would be the one to release it. The rules were not just chains to keep the entity in, they were the chains that kept me alive, but even that was slipping away. The storm had reached its peak, the winds howling like a wild animal, tearing through the pyramid's ancient stone. The walls groaned under the pressure, as though the entire structure was being pulled apart from the inside. Oren could feel the ground shaking beneath him, the pyramid itself trembling as the entity inside fought desperately to escape. It was as though the storm was alive, its fury a last desperate bid for freedom. Every part of him screamed to destroy the lighthouse, to break the rules and end this nightmare. He ran through the control room, his hands shaking, trying to find something, anything that would stop the light. But every time he moved to touch the controls, an invisible force pushed him back, slamming him into the wall. He couldn't escape it. The voice from the light grew louder, more insistent, calling his name. It was no longer a whisper, but a full, booming cry. "Oren," it begged. "Help me. I can free you." The words were so clear now, the tone sweet and inviting, promising escape from the torment of the pyramid, from the suffocating air, from the oppressive rules. But deep down, Oren knew it was a lie. The light didn't offer freedom. The entity needed him. It needed someone to replace the soul it had already consumed. And it was calling him, tempting him with lies. His body trembled as he approached the beacon, unable to resist its pull. He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the light. The closer he got, the stronger the pull became, as though the very light itself was alive, breathing, waiting for him. His heart raced, and for a moment he felt like he could escape, that the rules didn't matter anymore. Maybe he could break free from the grip of the pyramid. Maybe he could escape the madness, but as his fingers made contact with the light, everything around him froze. Time seemed to stop. Then came the pain, blinding, searing pain, as if his very soul was being torn apart. His body started to disintegrate, his skin burning away, his bones crumbling like dust. He screamed, but no sound came. The storm outside raged, and the entity's voice roared with triumph. The pyramid shuddered violently as Oren's body was consumed by the light, his soul trapped inside the stone. His mind, once his own, faded into darkness. But as the storm continued to howl, as the last remnants of Oren's being were absorbed into the pyramid, a new voice echoed from the control room. It was a voice that sounded eerily familiar. "Never turn off the light," it whispered, a chilling reminder of the rules Oren had once heard from Zivian Krith. And as the storm began to die down, a new keeper arrived at the pyramid. Unaware of the fate that awaited them, the cycle had begun again. The pyramid remained silent, its ancient secrets buried beneath layers of stone, as though nothing had changed. But deep within, the entity waited, its hunger never truly sated, and the light, always shining, always burning, was still there. A beacon, a prison, and a curse. Whoever came next would be caught in the same cycle, a new soul to replace the old, and the pyramid would continue to feed.